Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines are mostly the same. Exam 1, you might have noticed the deadline got extended another week. Not because, really need to, but for the quizzes of part 2, I extended the last 2 another week just because. So for exam 2, quizzes part 3, November 16th. Exam 3, 4, quizzes part 4, December 7th. And exam 5, final covering all the things, December 4th, deadline filing. For the paper, same deadlines as before, draft November 9th, plus 5 November 14th, emergency deadline November 21st, and the desperation deadline December 8th, the day after the day that you live in infamy. Before heading into our final adventures in the substance and substrata, anything about previous stuff, stuff that's been, stuff to be, that needs more stuff, all about the stuff. Okay, so last time we're looking at the battle that if you accept a trope theory, that crazy stuff.
Page now.
58.
So if you accept if you go into the problem reversals and say, hey, I want to be a realist and accept properties, then your choices pretty much are Platonic universals, known generically as transcendent universals, somewhere not here, or you can be like Aristotle or David Armstrong, immanent universals here, or you can accept trope theory, you accept properties are real, but they're tropes, like Keith Campbell and myself. And then once you buy into tropes, if you want to buy into them, you have a choice of having just bundles, bunches of tropes, or you can throw in a substrata. Again, kind of like accepting just cheese or cheese and crackers. Here's a terrible metaphor. Okay, so last time we were looking at arguments as to why you should accept substances and substrata. And we turned to Armstrong, who is Australian and now is sadly dead, still lives today as far as I know, the following argument. Now, one thing about properties is you can also have different orders of properties, higher order ones. And if you accept that properties are tropes, then all your different levels of tropes are, well, still tropes. Just like with universals too. So, if you have properties that have properties, then the question would be, if you have a bundle view, what would it be for like a first order trope to have a second order trope as a property? Well, if we accept the first order trope as a bundle of properties, Armstrong says in his classic Australian way that it's very unattractive. And Australians always have, most Australian philosophers, an interesting way of doing things. They often would write and they would leave out like all the steps. And they would use, Australian sayings like, it's clear which way the cat will jump on this one, whatever that means, or it's clear with the voice in the back room of heaven. It's like, what is that? But if you ask them, they can put in all the steps. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like doing philosophy by sayings that no one knows what the hell they mean. But there you go. I believe Crocodile Dundee for all that. So if a trope itself counts as a substratum relative to its second order properties, then why not just start with that? And so if you're, in order to handle these different orders of properties, if you get like 6 substrata in there anyways, why not just start with it?
And so ask you a question.
Sure.
If universals and tropes and stratas are basically the same, why not use the same terminology?
Well, they're different. And here's how, it's a good point. I mean, in a way they're very similar, because you have, if you divide stuff up, you say, what are properties, and if someone says, if suppose you're in the big metaphysical store, you go and you say, I'm looking to buy properties. And the store clerk would take you over to the aisle and say, here's our aisle of properties. And you look down them, and then they would say, here's one option is, universals. And these are, what are those? Well, they're things that can be multiply located, different places at the same time. And we have, 2 versions of those. We have the ones that are, they're not in the store, but we can order for you, or you can order from online because they're in the big Platonic heaven. So If you want those, it's kind of like getting a subscription, you know, to some phone service. You don't actually have it, it's like beamed to. And so the Platonic universals are here, they're someplace else, but they're universals. The entity universals, of course, are on the shelves and in stock, because they're universals that are here, and they can be multiple located. So there's only one, it's great for the store, because there's only one of each universal, but they can sell an infinite number of them, which is kind of a weird thing. It'd be like being able to, like, you make one donut, and you can sell it, you know, you can get 1 million people selling that donut. I said, that's all world hunger, I guess, if you can pull that off. Now, if you're not interested in universals, the clerk will take you over. Here's our other aisle, the aisle of tropes. In the trope aisle are properties that can exist only one place at one time. So kind of like, they're like actual donuts. If you want 10 of them, you gotta make 10. Now, once you buy your properties, then the question is, do you want something to put them on? You know, it's kind of like, there used to be a restaurant here in Tallahassee where you, instead of just like ordering a meal, you'd order like the parts of the meal, and you could actually do them separate, like you get like the meat and something else to put under it. I think bento box also does a similar thing.
Bento box, yeah.
Yeah, they have like different things you can get. And yeah, depending on what you want, want there. And so, or you could use an analogy like a sandwich, what kind of, do you want just like a slab of meat to chew on, or do you want bread? And Substrata would be like the bread. And so, do you want just, a bundle of, properties just to have, or do you want them on something? And the substrata are the things that hold the properties.
Okay. The story in the Bible where God has the fish and the loaf of bread, and he multiplies it, would that be like an immanent universal? Because you said that immanent universals can exist in multiple places at the same time, and since he didn't really, I lost my train of thought, or would it be a trope?
Oh, excellent question, because one way you could explain the miracle metaphysically is if things are made of universals and they can exist in different places at the same time, then you could creation would just be relocating them. And they already can do that, so you get like a fish and Jesus could just go, multi-locate more, because they're already multi-located. If you get 2 fish, they're already full of universals, and you just multi-locate more fish. You just create all the universals in them, or relocate the universals in them, and boom, you get fish. So that would be, never thought of this before, but the one way you could explain that. Now, trope theorists, you could also explain the miracle. You could say instead of multiplying the universals, he's creating more fish. Like it could be that it's a miraculous molecular transformation, creating fish out of the air. Or it could be, if you bring God in, who can create something from nothing, it could be literal creation. He's just, boom, there's some new tropes and some new fish, there we go. Yeah, so either theory could handle, actually someone should do a paper on that.
That's what exactly why.
Yeah, so you could do.
Don't steal my idea.
Yeah, the miracle of the fishes, the metaphysical miracle of the fishes. And be sure to include a recipe as well. Yeah, so Armstrong takes the conclusion, so that's the difference between that's why they all have different names. Now, we've seen this objection before. Now, one thing that, in terms of like, why doesn't everybody accept Substrata? And it's kind of like the question, why are the people who just like eat the sandwich meat without the bread? And the stock argument is a challenge put forth by our good dead friends, the dead empiricists, but it's still around today. And this argument, they use the term substance rather than substrata, but they're really going after what we're calling substrata. So, as you pointed out correctly, there's a lot of terms, and people, even when they're sometimes careful about them, a lot of times, especially like substance, it has a whole bunch of different meanings. But of course, to be fair, if you go in the dictionary, for almost any word, you'll see a lot of meanings. So is the empiricist argument. Well, it's one we've seen before, with a epistemic twist. Now, the claim is from the empiricist that all we know about the stuff that's out there comes through our senses from out there. So whatever we know about the world, it has to be something that can impinge on our senses. And of course, that's the property of objects, like the qualities that cause us to perceive color, the texture, the weight, etc. So substratas are properties, so there's no way we can know them. They don't impinge on the senses. So since we have no empirical evidence for them, the sensible thing is to say they exist is simply wild, unsupported speculation. It's like someone claiming like there are ghosts, but never actually seeing one. And these are unseeable. So the conclusion is we shouldn't do this because we have no empirical evidence for
So
them.
you're saying there's no empirical evidence that that thing has weight?
Oh, there is. I mean, the empiricists would say, yeah. They would say, that all we know about the folder is based on its properties that we can perceive empirically. Like, the weight, the size, the shape, the spinability, etc. But when we look at it, we never see the substrata. We never perceive that because it doesn't have any properties. It doesn't impinge on our senses. And so the empiricists say to claim there's something we know not what under all those properties is unjustified speculation because we can't dig down. If you're wondering like what's at the bottom of a parfait, and it's not in a clear glass, you can dig down and find what's on the bottom. Probably a mouse, frozen mouse licking up your chair. I know it's terrifying. That's what you don't want to find. What's worse than it would be half a mouse that you've been eating it. Like the old joke. About what's worse than a worm in an apple? Half a worm. So we can't dig down and find like, oh yeah, there's the property, there's the supported properties that we perceive. Now there's also a slightly milder argument, which is this. We understand properties reasonably well. I mean, not like in perfect detail, but we get things like color, mass, volume, density, etc. And we experience them. This alleged binder, the substrata thing, we never experience it. You don't get like stuck to you like, it's not really like like when you're trying to super glue something, in your hands. It's not like you find, oh man, I got metaphysical binder on my hands. How am I gonna get this off? So we don't experience it, we don't understand it, and so it's super mysterious. So going back to our methodology, it's weird and mysterious. So properties, yeah, that's normal everyday life. Blue, warm, delicious, savory, spicy, etc. All makes sense. But binder properties, what is that?
And so the substrata would be the binder that holds
Yep.
everything
Yeah, the binder that holds it all together, which we don't actually.
together. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't actually seem to experience. Now, so this argument, that argument's a pretty good one because again, it goes with the mysteriousness factor, and binders are weird, mysterious. Plus, you throw in the cost factor. Looking at Occam's razor, you end up with some advantages for bundle theory. Now, one way to reply to this is to say, okay, we can solve the problem because we need a binder of some sort. So we're kind of in a bind, sorry about the pun, in that we need something to hold all of the tropes together, but it's got to be something that we have a reason to believe in. So one option is this. We could avoid the cost of having substrata and then bring in something we could actually know about, and we can make them properties, because we know about properties. We can call them knowable binding tropes, or KBT, which no one ever called them until now. So you could say that the substratum has a property of binding properties by which it may be known. Now, of course, the problem here is this. If we go with binding tropes that are possessed by substrata, and tropes need them to bound by substrata, then we end up with that binding problem again. It's like the glue problem. You gotta glue your glue to the glue to the glue to the glue to the glue, and so you need infinite glue. Now, if you try to go without the substrata, well, then you end up with just back to the binding trope problem. So it seems like this seems to be a mess either way, because you just go, okay, there's tropes you can know, but then the problem is, well, if you don't have any binder, the problem is, how do you have any substances? Then you say, okay, we got a binding trope that you can know, and the problem is you end up with that infinite regress. And if you like have a substratum with them stuck to it, then you've got the binding trope going to infinity with substratum, so you have double problems, and that's a big super mess. So it's like that one's like, to use an analogy, it's like you've glued the, you know, the thing you're trying to fix, glued like you're the broken cup to yourself. And now you're stuck going through life with a big cup glued to you. So not good. Now fortunately our good dead friend Descartes had a way to address this problem. Descartes was a rationalist, believing that you can know stuff by pure reason, and of course he's the I think, therefore I am God. And giving rise to the joke of, you know, Descartes on an airplane, the steward comes up and says, would you care for something to eat? He says, I think not, and so he vanishes. But he's my philosophers, with the exception of Steve Martin, probably shouldn't become comedians. Now Descartes' principle of philosophy, he makes the following argument. This is credited to our good dead friend Descartes. And Descartes embraced two types of substance. The ghosty stuff, which is the mind, which thinks, and the material stuff, which doesn't think but is extended, you know, soul and body. Now, he claims the way we become aware of substances is not by it existing, because that doesn't have an effect on us. We know it by its attributes, because if something's got a property, we know there must be something there, he claims, because nothing has no properties. So there's got to be something there. So if we perceive something, a quality, he claims we can infer there's something to which it is attributed. There's something that's got it. And if we know that properties can't exist without being the property of something, and we know properties exist, we can infer that these substances exist by inference. So even though we can't perceive them directly, we infer by their theirs.
So that's what I was saying, because I remember that Descartes was against the empiricist, because he said that you can know stuff by just reasoning. See, that makes sense.
Now this method may seem kind of sketchy. You know, like, oh, we can know things by, you know, indirect observation, but it's actually legitimate in science. For example, in the case of like subatomic particles, like electrons, for example, we've never actually seen electrons. Because in a way, the best microscope, the smallest microscope we've got, I believe this is still correct, is an electron microscope. So you can't see electrons by shooting them with electrons. At least I believe so. Could be wrong. And so we can't actually, so how do we know they exist? Well, we never directly observe them, we observe their effects. So we infer from the effect that there must be an electron. Another example in science, we've not yet seen another planet outside of our solar system, yet scientists are confident that they exist. How can they be so confident? Well, they have indirect evidence. One is, which is pretty brilliant, is that you can measure the output of suns, you know, how much light they're putting out. And if something moves in front of them, that lowers the output by a measurable amount. And if it occurs at a regular, you know, because if there's a planet orbiting the sun, it'll block a little bit of the sun regularly, like on the orbiting cycle. So every certain amount of time, there'll be that orbit, you know, it'll be on our side of that sun. And so we never actually see the planet itself directly, but we know from our observation that it has to be there. Unless the aliens are just screwing with us.
Suppose they have an asteroid belt that rotates around that particular sun, and at these different intervals, you'll see that particular asteroid or some asteroids rotating there around that, and then they're mistaking it to be outside.
True, I mean, they could be mistaken on what's causing it. Because until they actually observe it, it could be, you know, like I said, it need not be like the planet, it could be something else causing that effect.
And I brought that up because they teach theory as if it were law. They tell you all these things. and we believe this to be that, and that to be this, and this, the other. But you're teaching it as it is law. And I think that's, to me, that's problematic.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is the important question of at what point does a theory become so well established that it's in, you know, that, well, actually, any credible scientist would say there's no such thing as an absolutely certain theory, because if they've read philosophy, they know that problem induction, they know the problem scientific method, you could always be wrong.
Yeah.
But you know, there's a practical question, at what point do you say this is so certain that we should teach it, and say this is almost certainly
Well,
true?
take evolution again. When they first started out, they said that human beings came from the one-cell animals. And they couldn't prove that, so they changed it. Now they're teaching that evolution is just the chain between, to paraphrase, between generations of species, whether it's the plant, the animal, it's how the DNA might change from one generation to the next. As far as it's,
Well, I mean, the scientists, they believe that it's been established as true beyond a reasonable doubt. And they say, if someone says the theory of evolution, they would say, yes, you know, it's a theory, but it's not a theory in the sense of we're just still guessing at this, but in the sense that it is like the theory of gravity, something established.
Yeah.
Now, even in that case, of course, if someone's honest, they would have to admit that there's a non-zero probability that evolution could be mistaken. You still could have, they haven't conclusively shown absolute deductive certainty that, you know, creation is not true. But they believe it's the best science. Yeah, I mean, you could take issue with, actually, thanks to the challenges of epistemology and skepticism, you could take issue with anything to teach.
you said they found out that creation is not true.
Not at all, that's the theory, because if evolution is true, then the story that that things were created as they are would have to be false. So if we evolved, we were not created, if we evolved from single cells to humans, you know, then we were not created, the Adam and Eve story would be
Yeah, but you said that they had proven that.
Oh, they haven't proven it with absolute certainty, because there can be no absolute, as far as I know now, well, we can't be absolute certain, there can't be absolute certainty.
But properties generally follow a law, right? And if blue and yellow makes green, blue and yellow gonna always make green, right?
We think, but if you take if you read Hume's problem of induction, blue and yellow have made green always to now, but something different could happen tomorrow. We don't think it's likely to happen, but the challenge is, how could you prove with absolute certainty that this is always going to work this way? Yeah, Hume's argument was that all we can go on is what's happened in the past, but the future is the unexplored country. So we don't know with absolute certainty.
How do they justify that there are any one-cell animals turning into humans now?
Well, the response is, it would be you'd have to wait, to conduct that experiment, you'd have to wait like 4 billion years. You need to start with a single cell.
It's still, you don't see none in the process.
Yeah, but then true, I mean, a fair point. The scientists do point to species that do seem to be transition. And of course, one point they make is that evolution doesn't occur within our life. You're not going to see, you know.
But again, that's why I say it's problematic, because they set these things in such a way that you could ever have any proof for it. Like they say the sun will blow up in 70 million years.
But creation, you don't have proof of creationism either, you're just going on something you read. So, I mean, the argument can be given both ways.
I agree.
Frankly. So, I mean, I feel like it's just a matter of what you believe personally and not inflicting it on the general public. Because that's what you believe, as long as it's not disrupting anyone else's belief, because there is no real issue with the evolutionary theory. It's been proven that there are creatures.
Well, even the Vatican accepts evolution now. So, because you can still believe the world was created, and then accept that God, like, you know, created the world.
Orchestrated.
Yeah, and then eventually you get us. So it's theologically acceptable to some. Now, so if we're going to accept substrata, and we accept, try to engage that problem, knowing stuff, we cannot contend that you can know these substrata not directly, but by inference. Again, to go back to the analogy of the electron, or the planets that we get by inference. And so, if we accept that tropes can't just be hanging out on their own, they need to be bound by something, when we encounter a property, we can infer there must be something that it's stuck to. Just like if we see like a track in a cloud chamber, and we are pretty sure that's caused by electrons, we can infer, even though we can't see the electron, that the electron is there making that happen. Now, we could always be wrong. We could, as you pointed out with the analogy with the planets, they could be wrong on what's there. And with the substrata, we could be making an incorrect inference, totally wrong. But this is a principal way to reply back to the empiricists, namely that if you allow for indirect knowledge of things, which empiricists often do, then this would be acceptable. Now, a person could, of course, bite the bullet and say, there's no such thing as indirect knowledge, you must observe directly, in which case they would have to, and philosophers have done this, you have to reject the existence of electrons and anything you can perceive.
So really it's just like using abstract knowledge, like logic, to think of instead of like, because it seems like the empiricists are more concrete logic,
Yes.
and using more like abstract reasoning to get to these ends.
Yeah, for the empiricists, you got to be able to observe with the senses,
Mhm.
and they're skeptical, and often rightly so, about just using your pure reason to get stuff. And the rationalists say, well, there are things that we can know that we don't directly observe. Now, one of the most serious problems with substrata, in addition to the first one again, is we don't seem to be able to know them. The second is they're kind of naked. So maybe you wouldn't want to know them because they're all naked and stuff. And the problem is called bare substrata, or sometimes called bare particulars. And this is one that's been caused a problem a long time. And here's the problem. It's a pretty serious one. Well, for substrata. So there are two options. Either substrata have properties of their own, like they got clothing, to use a metaphor, or they're naked, or naked, as some people say in some parts of the world. Now, if they do have properties of their own, they're still naked. Just like if you have clothes, one is still naked under one's clothes. So technically, we're always naked, just under our clothes. A friend of mine, I remember there's a comedian, I think, he used to say that. We're all naked all the time, just under our clothes. I'm like, true, but weird.
Yeah.
But it really stuck with me for some reason. It always stuck with me. So, either way, substrata must ultimately be bare. They must have no clothes. So here's the problem. Difficulty one. If they're bare, it would seem they could not be binders, because they're just, they're totally bare. And if they can't bind stuff, then there's no reason to have them, because they don't do anything. It'd be just like, it'd be like going to the store and the person trying to sell you something, like, what does this do? Nothing. No, I don't want the nothing. Or someone saying, oh, do you want to pay extra so I can I'll put a plastic disc in your hamburger? It's like, can I digest that? No. It's like, no thanks. Difficulty two. One problem is the problem of individuation, which is what is it that separates things and makes them individuals? We normally don't think of this, but it is a important metaphysical problem. What is it that separates things so we're not all just one thing? Now, in the case of bare substrata, they have no qualitative differences between them. So, there's supposed to be a lot of them. So then the question is, how are they different? Now, thanks to our good friend Leibniz, who developed Leibniz's law, he claims that if things have different properties, they're different. If they're the same properties, they're the same. But substrata have 0 properties, so they all, in a sense, they all have the same properties because they have none. So they'd all be identical. So you can only have one. And of course, that'd be a problem because substrata is supposed to be the things that, you know, the properties all stick to that make them into individuals. So for example, each of us, this is not really, of course, how it would work, but each of us would have like a substrata, and then everything is stuck to that. You know, of course, it'd be like, not exactly like that, but that's kind of the idea. So the question is then, what separates the substrata? How do we have a lot of things that are all seemingly identical? How do you do that? And not just like kind of similar, you know, we all understand how you can have like a, you know, a bunch of like ball bearings or plastic chips or something that are all, you know, all very much the same, very similar. But of course, even then, even they have some slight differences between them. So here's how to reply. Reply 1. Cheat. You can take the binding ability as a capacity that's not a property. So this, of course, comes at a price. And the price is to make binding primitive. Now, that, of course, is a price. What you have to do when buying metaphysical theories, it's like when you're going to buy a laptop or a smartphone. Namely, if you're going to buy a smartphone, you're not required to buy a particular one, but if you're going to buy one, you have to buy, buy a smartphone. You buy one of them. And they all have, you know, problems and defects. There's no perfect smartphone. And so when you're buying any theory, what you're doing is you're comparing them to make your choice to each other. So it's a question of which one wins the competition among what's competing. And they may all be pretty bad, but whichever one is the best of the lot, that's the one to go with.
Sounds like voting, just picking the lesser of the two evils.
Yeah, essentially, yeah, it's like exactly like voting. Except, you know, metaphysical theory doesn't do horrible things. You know. Or good things, it just kind of hangs out.
It is.
It just is. Now, honesty compels one to admit that that's a high price to pay, taking its primitive. But of course, as we saw, if you get binding tropes, you get an infinite regress. Boom. That's like the worst. In this case, you have something that binds, you can't explain it, so you might as well just go with it being primitive. So it's not good, but it's not the worst. Which is often how I pick the food to get like late at night.
Like having a bad combo, they eat smooth.
It's not, it won't kill you, but it's not that great. Difficulty 2, individuation. Now, once again, cheat. This is to be taken as a primitive as well, individuation. And then, of course, adds to the price tag. Just like, you know, if you're going for like a really awesome smartphone that like reads your mind or something, or has like a laser in it, death laser, or a gun. Probably make those.
I wonder if they make a case that looks like a gun.
Yeah.
And then like the police had to go on news and say, don't use those, because we might kill you.
Yeah. Yeah, they were like, yeah, it's like, that is like a bad idea. If you want to carry something that looks like a gun, you might as well just go with a gun, because at least it'll gun things.
Yeah.
And you don't need something that like looks like a gun, you're just like pulling out, or that always goes badly. Although it was funny for a while, until something gets shot. Now, so why is this okay to do? Not the gun thing, but the individuation thing. Well, one way, and this is a useful tactic, not just in metaphysics, but anywhere in life, if you suffer from a problem and you're in a competition with other people or anything else, or you know, like your business or whatever competition you're in, and you get a problem, but everyone else has the same problem, it's fair, perfectly just to say, yes, I have this problem, everyone does too, so logically, can't be any reason to pick one over the other because they all have the same problem. It'd be like someone saying, well, I don't want to get this phone because its battery, it doesn't have a 5-year battery. It's like, true, that phone doesn't have a 5-year battery, but none of them do. So it's not a problem for, it's a problem all phones have.
Not a problem of choice.
Yeah. So how can we show that individuation is always going to be primitive? That this is a problem for everybody? Well, here's how it goes. Suppose we take an entity. I'll use my sunglasses to stand in, and we say that the individuality of this, it being it and nothing else, is not a primitive thing. It has to be analyzed. So suppose we say that the individuator of this is this folder somehow. So it makes the glasses, or we could say, be less stupid, but still pretty stupid. We could say it's this little symbol here, which makes it individual glasses, metaphysically speaking. Now, either the little symbol's got to be individuated itself, just primitively individuated, or there's got to be something that we analyze that, what individuates the symbol. Now, if we analyze it, we would have to say, we say, well, it's this little piece here that does it. Well, then the question arises, does that little piece, does it individuate itself, or is it individuated? And as you can see, this heads off on an infinite regress. So either you have two choices. Either you end up in an infinite regress, which is doom, or you end up, not a great invader's end, yeah, pretty bad. Or you end up with a primitive individuation. So infinite regress, primitive individuation, and so the gist of it is everyone's basically screwed by this. And there's only two ways you go. Infinite regress, which is the worst of all possible options, or just say, yep, individuation has to be primitive at some level. Problem for everybody, so a problem for nobody.
Boy, you can't prove anything.
Well, I can prove it. I can prove that there's got to be an individuator that is self-individuating. Otherwise, there'd be no individuals. So done. Now, but to try to refute that, someone may come along, or someone who comes along to ruin things, and say, but I do not accept your sunglass analogy. Nothing can be self-individuating. Why not? Well, if something is self-individuating, then you get that requirement regress. For X, an individual itself requires that it be an individual already. But for it to be an individual, it must individuate itself. Now the regress here runs out very much like parent-child regress. Could someone be their own parent? Well, no, because they'd already have to exist before they existed to be their parent. And similarly here, if something individuates itself, it would already have to be an individual to individuate itself, so that can't happen. So one other approach is say, well, maybe we can go with properties that are individuated by their powers. But then again, whenever you bring up an individuator, the question is, what individuates that? And then that. So no matter what we do, we end up with individuation as a primitive at some level, because there's no way to handle that infinite regress. So again, problem for everybody, so a problem for nobody. Now, one of my fellow trope theorists is a fellow named Keith Campbell. No relation to the soup company, as far as I know, because I think he's Australian. Now, he brought up the following objection. He claims, perhaps correctly, that all causal interaction in the world is between properties affecting properties. So being without properties, substratum would seem to be immune to all causal activity. Nothing can be done to them. So this would mean, A, for fortiori, that they ought to be metaphysically indestructible, because they can never be affected by properties. Now, his objection here is basically, that's weird, the weirdness objection. What else in the natural order is immune to destruction? Now, one reply I didn't think of when I wrote the paper, which I should have, it's pretty obvious, is that, well, there are a lot of things that are immune to destruction, namely everything, because according to physics, matter energy can either be created or destroyed, so this would seem to be perfectly reasonable. There's obviously, if science is true about this, lots of stuff that can't be destroyed. But here's the replies I had. First reply, one option is this. You could claim that every substratum has an essence, which would be a trope it has by necessity. And if this was destroyed, the substratum would also perish. Now, an obvious reply at this point would be, hey, you're just making stuff up to avoid the problem. But a way to reply to that is, well, at least I'm not alone. And there's a principal way to do this. Descartes, as I mentioned, claimed there's two types of substance. Body, which is by nature extended, and mind, which by nature thinks. Now, if a mind stopped thinking, would it still be a mind? Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, so, or if you take if you take the property that's central to bodies, for him, it's extension. If you took away the extension of bodies, would it exist? Well, according to Descartes, no. So this would be a principal way to reply, possibly. Reply two. You could say that no substratum can ever be completely bare. That to lose a trope means you always somehow get a new one. So their indestructibility would not be a problem, because a bare substratum couldn't exist on its own, and if a single mass trope can't exist on its own, a single substrata cannot. And so tropes and substrata are mutually dependent, and so neither can exist without the other. So a minimal substance would be a substratum plus the minimum number of tropes. So they wouldn't be indestructible in this view, they would be as destructible as anything else. So problem possibly solved. So in conclusion, the trope substrata view it's got a lot of problems, but it does seem to be the most plausible. And the most plausible view is the tropeless view of substrata. Namely, you get substrata, which has two primitive qualities, or no, can't say qualities, has two primitive features. One is, first, binding capacity. Secondly, it's got primitive individuation, which again is a price. These are two prices that must be paid. So substrata are not substances and can't exist without the tropes. And tropes are not substances and can't exist without substrata. And so reality is composed of cheese and crackers, essentially. Tropes being the cheese, the substrata being the crackers. Delicious, delicious reality. And so ends the tropes. Now our final bit is a break from Western metaphysics with a journey to Eastern metaphysics. And of course, Taoism. Now one thing, if you've read the Tao Te Ching, or the works of Confucius or other philosophers of that time period from that part of the world, you notice there's quite a bit of difference between Western style philosophy, Aristotle and Plato, compared to their contemporaries like Confucius and Lao Tzu. And one big difference is that the Greeks did philosophy by arguing every single point. Plato and Aristotle argue everything. Whereas if you read through the Tao Te Ching or the works of Confucius or the analects of Confucius, you won't see arguments. You'll essentially see sayings, which is where, presumably the idea for like fortune cookie perhaps came from. They like Confucius say. And the reason why they say that is because the analects of Confucius weren't actually written by him, it was his students writing down stuff. So they would actually say Confucius said that. And that's where, if you wonder like, where did that come from? Confucius say, and that's where it came from. So what did the Taoists say? Well, a key part of Taoism is, of course, the Tao. It's their central metaphysical concept, which is later stolen by a fellow named George Lucas and made into The Force, and then made into 3 good movies, 3 bad movies, and then taken by Disney and made into more movies. Although Rogue One was pretty good. Haven't seen
Which one you like best?
Oh, the Star Wars movies? I like the first one the best because when I was a kid, it was just nuts. It was like the best. It was one of those movies that I saw. I'll never recapture it.
3 days to see that movie. 3 days in line,
Hmm.
all day, all night.
We should have been in Maine. We don't have enough people to make lines. I didn't have to wait at all. I just went there.
Are you serious?
Oh, because Maine. We don't even have a million people in the whole state. Yeah, it's rare that you had to, well, now there's more people, but back then, it was wild animals. Well, the moose got run by.
I mean, you have to eat moose.
No, I don't like moose.
I like rabbits, but I've eaten them.
Sure. No, I've never eaten a moose. Deer, most animals will, if I like the animal, then I won't eat it. Like I won't eat dogs or cats.
Yes.
Well, I won't eat them either,
Good.
but rabbits, squirrels, I've eaten moose, it's good.
I'd rabbit, it's good. Duck, goose, duck, goose, turducken.
Well, you just said you hated ducks, so.
Geese, I hate geese, I like
Geese,
ducks.
ducks was geese.
Ducks can be okay. Geese,
They're all terrible.
they know what they've done. They know their
They're
crimes.
such evil.
True. So next time, we'll finish up the last of the Taoism. Be sure to complete quizzes for part 2, except for the last 2 by today. And exam 1, if you've already finished it, great. If you haven't, again, I bumped the deadline back like a week because people who are here today were asked, presumably they're taking the exam, they were asking about bumping it forward because they were concerned about like, the impact of the storm.
Mhm.
So have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday for the Taoism.